when Beth and I were talking about who we wanted to have these conversations with, I said, why don't we reach out to Jim? I'd really like to talk with him. So
Thank you. I'm very honored to be able to do this. I really appreciate it.
And there's really nobody else we would want to tackle this subject matter of spirituality with. I mean, seriously, nobody else, because this is something I always tie to you. And I'm excited to do this topic because I've never seen it done before, and not in a professional podcast kind of conversation. For professionals, this common ground is really, it's called Common Ground Conversations in the Continuum of Care. And the idea is for professionals to come together and have authentic conversations about how we address issues, not in acute care, but continuing care, which I know is where you've always directed your career path, and Kira and I as well. So for us, spirituality is more implicit than stated. And I think that's true for a lot of quality centers. For you, it's something you've always been out about. So we want you to be out recording.
Okay. Well, it's really interesting. My title, Spiritual Life Director, I've been doing that here at MARR for a little over a year now. Prior to that, I was CEO of MARR.
Yep.
And that was just not something that I found fulfilling. And we hadn't had a spiritual life director for about 15 years. And so I redesigned, as CEO, I was able to redesign the position and step into it. But I was the clinical director here at MARR prior to that, and I've been the executive director of a place called Breakthrough House,
yep,
and coordinator for clinical services at Emory Hospital, and worked at SAFE, as you mentioned, and as a counselor. But I got my start in this field before that as a clinical chaplain. And I was a clinical chaplain in the Emory at Emory Hospital on the addictive disorders unit, and so which was under the Division of Psychiatry at the time. And so, as a psychiatric clinical chaplain working with addictive disorders, that was something that I really enjoyed doing. And it's so interesting that 30 years later, I have found my way back to that, kind of full circle, coming back around to what I probably should have been doing in the field all along. Something that is deeply embedded in all of us, and that we'll talk about, how addiction affects it and all that. But it's just so critical and so important.
Well, it literally is at the heart of everything, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes.
Whether we state it or not.
Yeah. Yes.
Can you help us flesh it out a little bit? What that it is, that spirit? How would you define spirituality? This thing that you can't help it just oozes from you, and it resonates, and we feel it, but defining it is something else. How do you define it?
Well, when we think about spirituality, Jerome Dollard said spirituality is a lot like health. We have good health or poor health, but we cannot help but having health. And spirituality is the same way. Every human being is spiritual, Dollard says, and it's just whether we have healthy spirituality or unhealthy spirituality. So when we think about spirituality, I usually, particularly in the context of treatment, I think about it as connection. Okay, and in that sense, it is something that is innate in us. Whether we acknowledge it or not, we have some very basic needs as human beings. And the first need that kept us alive was the need to be in relationship. And that, as infants, we cannot survive unless we are in relationship. And as we grow older, those relationships, of course, become more complex, but the need for them does not necessarily diminish. It diminishes on a physical level, but not on an emotional level. And so the need to be in relationship changes and grows over time. And the second thing, I think, as human beings, we will constantly strive to feel whole or complete. We will constantly strive to grow and change and to kind of reinvent ourselves, but to constantly be in a process of growth. It is this process of growth that is the essence of what spirituality is about. And this is not my definition, by the way, but so if we think about spirituality as the process of growing into a deeper connection with ourselves, with others, with the world around us, and with a power greater than ourselves or God, then we kind of hit what spirituality is truly about. It's not a moment in time. It's not a thing we can capture. It is the process itself. And so while religion can be a good thing and help us with our spirituality, it is not in and of itself spirituality. Ethical rules of right and wrong can help us with spirituality, help us with that connection, but they are not in and of themselves spirituality. Spirituality is this process of growing and changing. And in his book, Addiction and Grace, Gerald May really talks about this longing that we all have to be more, to do more, in this growth. And the interesting thing is we see this reflected in nature all around us. If you walk outside, you have a snapshot of things as they are at this second, but everything is growing, everything is changing constantly. And we are no different than that. As human beings, we like to try to hold things, no, this is the way it is. And, by the way, I'm a Methodist, but I'm also an ordained minister, Baptist minister. But so a lot of times religion wants to hold it, no, this is how you practice spirituality. And human beings, we do that so often, we want to hold it right there. But the bottom line is, it is constantly growing, constantly changing. I've been married for 40 years, and the relationship that my wife and I have is constantly changing, constantly growing. And so from that perspective, it becomes deeply spiritual. I think that so many people have difficulty in their relationships when it becomes static and doesn't change. When in reality, a relationship is constantly dynamic. Nature is constantly dynamic. We are constantly dynamic, growing, changing, and so that's spirituality. That's what that is. And from that perspective, then, addiction poses a real problem for us because addiction, one client put it this way, that connection, it obliterates it. Mm-hmm. Addiction obliterates connection with ourselves, with other people, with the world around us, and with God. And it reduces it all, it subverts it all to the object, alcohol or drugs, or the ritual, such as behavioral addiction, such as gambling addiction or sexual addiction. And so it kind of reduces the focus of everything, becomes reduced to that. And spirituality then is completely subverted.
Jim, because of your background, because of your connection to clergy, your background in that, and because of your title, people can see you coming. They know a little bit about what you're about. Obviously not entirely what you're about, but you have that, right? And so it can, and maybe it's not ever used as kind of an entree to, or a setup for a discussion you're going to have with somebody. As you said, and I think Beth, you said at the beginning of the conversation that this is This is part of how a lot of us want to be and practice in this field, but we're not talking about it all the time. And specifically, Jim, with people who have some trauma related to how they grew up, that really affected their spiritual growth or health and their relationship with God and their relationship with religion, or whatever that looks like. I think people can be quite reticent to embark in this conversation. And I know how I've in the past tried to bring spirituality in, or not tried to, but been open to that happening or inviting of that happening. I'm curious, how do you go there with people when you think that spirituality as an element and healing there can be helpful to them?
The question of trauma, for example, you mentioned. When trauma occurs, I'm always interested in a person's life when the trauma occurs in their stages of development, because that will radically affect either what gets set in place or how things develop from that point. And how trauma, one of the ways trauma affects spirituality, whether it's physical, sexual, emotional, or spiritual abuse, is that it immediately, especially at a young age, it immediately puts the emphasis onto another. As we start to grow older from infancy into toddlerhood, we begin to try to get a sense of self. And apart from our parents, apart from our families, we begin to try to develop a sense of self. If trauma is introduced at that point, the sense of self kind of gets thrown off course, and the abuser then becomes the focus. So it kind of short circuits that connection with the self and puts it onto the other person. And so the emphasis then becomes survival rather than growth. And survival, either in pleasing the other person or avoiding the other person or defending against the other person or situation. And so we are kind of left without a basis for self with that. That allows shame to begin to enter in on a very deep level. And the way I explain this to clients is that I draw this up on the board. Here we are, here's kind of us, and shame begins to coat this. And it could be shame messages, it could be abuse, whatever. It starts to put a coating like rust on the shell, quote unquote, of ourself. And so we're not connected with ourself to start out with. And if we don't get a good connection with ourself, it's extremely difficult to have a healthy connection with others, with God, with the world around us. So in some ways, the one of the first things I want to do is to look at with clients those shame messages that coat the self. Now, in order to do that, and in treatment, we have this perfect opportunity. You have to remove the layers that the person has put around the shame. So, for example, I don't want you to see my shame. I don't want you to see that I'm just a worthless piece of crap, in my opinion. And so I put these barriers around that. It could be anger, it could be intelligence, it could be pleasing others. And addiction certainly is a layer around that. So a person comes into treatment, we immediately peel off the addiction. Then we start working on the other defenses. And I have often said to clients, all I see are your defenses. I don't really see you. And so, but once we start peeling these things away, we get down to that core, that shame. And people will believe that that core of shame is who they are. But that's not who we are. That's not how we were born. Shame was given to us. And so it becomes, first of all, it becomes a matter of getting down to that and beginning to work with that shame to begin to peel that away. And it doesn't all disappear, by the way. Begin to peel that away in order to get to that person, who they truly are. And oftentimes, I know for clients, it's the first time in their life that they have been faced with that question. Well, who am I? I don't know who I really am. And So of course that gives us a really rich kind of avenue to work with. So there's, from that perspective, is one way to begin to work on introducing spirituality to the person. The other way is, and by the way, I do a 6-hour workshop on addressing spirituality and treatment. So this is kind of a real thumbnail sketch. The other thing I do is I have a weekly group. I also, I can do one-to-one sessions with people and this and that, but I do a weekly group that is spirituality and recovery. I mean, the 12-step program talks about it all the time, and it's a necessity for recovery. So we designed a group that focuses specifically on it. And the first group in the series is on spirituality. And I talk about the connection. I talk about it from that perspective in terms of connection. And everybody gets that one, regardless of what they believe or don't believe. Everybody gets that one. That connection has been broken by the addiction. And it's kind of like, I give this example, it's kind of like eating nothing but celery. Spiritually, addiction is like eating nothing but celery. If you eat nothing but celery, you will die of malnutrition while feeling full. And so addiction sets up this kind of trick on us. It sets up this feeling of fulfillment, but really we're just getting gratification. It sets up peace. It says, well, I'll give you peace, but really all we get is numbness. And so we get these substitutes for true spirituality, fulfillment, intimacy, safety. Addiction will promise these things, but of course it doesn't grant them. And it leaves us feeling emptier. And so what do? Well, we go back to the addiction to do more. And so it sets up this cycle, and that just continues to empty us out spiritually and promote this spiritual malnutrition. But yet we still feel like we're getting something. And so I also introduce it like that.
And it's easy, right? It's easy.
Oh, yeah.
Substitutes
Yeah.
at the beginning.
Yeah. So I think that the first thing I try to do is help them understand the necessity of and the awareness of their spiritual need. And from that perspective, we are experts at wounding ourselves spiritually, at wounding this connection. And so we have to come to a place where we realize this. Now, this is one of the reasons I absolutely love the 12 steps so much, is because the 12 steps methodically and systematically work us through spirituality, with the first step being that awareness of our need, our desperate need of something different, something better. Then step 2 takes us outside of ourselves and looks towards something infinite, something beyond ourselves, whether it's the group, whether it's AA, or whether it's God. Really early in recovery, for me doesn't matter. Yeah. Just so the person becomes willing to look outside of themselves, like it talks about in Appendix 2, the spiritual experience, openness, willingness, and honesty to look outside of ourselves. And so once that is accomplished, then we can begin to look at a God of our understanding in step 3 and get us into that kind of connection there. But then steps 4 and 5 take us back into looking at ourselves, that connection with ourselves. Then 6 and 7 take us back to God and looking at that connection with God. Then 8, 9, and 10 begin to look at the connection with others. 11 then takes us back to that connection with God. And then 12 is this, as a result of the spiritual awakening, we have this expansive view of being of service to others and helping others, where we have, moved beyond ourselves into, a much bigger worldview and a way of service to others. And so the 12 steps in and of themselves, this is one of the reasons I love them so much. The 12 steps in and of themselves promote spiritual growth for folks. And so that it's just this, they draw us into connection. If you work the steps seriously, you're going to be drawn into connection. And I think everyone should work the steps, whether they're in recovery or not, frankly. But it will constantly draw us into connection if we're serious about working the steps. Also, one of the things I do is in my groups, I do a workshop on spirituality where I introduce the concept. We talk about connection. We talk about the ways that addiction throws us off of that. And then I give some kind of tips on moving forward with strengthening spirituality. And but also I do groups that I focus on things that hinder our spiritual growth or will hinder our recovery. So I talk about shame. I do a whole group on shame. I do a group on forgiveness. Actually, I split that one up into two. The first one is forgiving ourselves, which always has some very lively discussions. And then I do a group on forgiving others. And I also talk about grief and loss because, addiction is just a big grief and loss generator. And so talk about grief and loss. I also talk about God and conceptualizing God. How do we see God? And this gets to one of your other questions, that so many people have been so damaged in their view of God by previous experiences. And so if there's resistance there, one of the first things I want to look at is what's been your experience? And because a lot of times that resistance has nothing to do with a well-formulated belief system. Typically, people with well-formulated belief systems don't feel threatened and, don't mind a differing belief system. However, persons who have been hurt through some type of abuse or hurt, through a church or a person, they will oftentimes feel threatened at this topic. And so I try to take it out of the religion part of it into, how the program talks about spirituality. But so the first thing, a person who is highly resistant to it, I will try to get to what is the source of the resistance. And again, it's usually anger or resentment against a situation or a person or an institution. And let's talk about that first. Let's try to work through that first before we, because that's going to block them every single time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And apart from dealing with, if they don't have those kinds of negative experiences, what I find most often is just a misunderstanding of what spirituality truly is. And so looking at that, as we talked about, the real nature of what spirituality is oftentimes very eye-opening for them. Even for someone who is a devout atheist, atheism is a belief system and it requires a great deal of faith, quite frankly. And so even someone who approaches this from an atheistic perspective can still find spirituality if we look at it from a connection standpoint.
Right.
Because even with God, they have this, there is a connection there. They simply reject, an idea of a God. But even with that, though, they can get with the spiritual principles, behind the 12 steps, honesty, integrity, open-mindedness, perseverance, all those principles that are behind the 12 steps that are spiritual in nature. Even without a belief in God, we can get with those. Even faith is simply, when you think about the word faith, almost everybody says, oh, you're talking about God now, and they don't want to hear it a lot of times. But faith really is just a belief or confidence in something or someone outside of myself.
More than me. Yeah.
Yeah. And so from that perspective, I always tell clients, I say, look, you are exercising faith right now. You're sitting here.
Mm-hmm.
That's an act of faith. Faith is simply you sitting here because you believe that this program is going to give you something. That's an act of faith. And so I like to try to, take whatever faith they have and work from that point and build on that. And so many times they think, oh, I've lost my faith, or I don't have faith, or anything like that. But they are exercising faith every single day they come back. And every single day they, they work the steps and call the response. Those are extreme acts of faith rather than just going back to using.
I love that so much. And we talk about that all the time. Beth says it all the time. It's in the signature of her email, trust the process, just this idea that there is a process. And when somebody says, I have no faith, and I said, you walked through the door today.
Right. Yeah.
Are you kidding me? I mean, there must be a grain of a belief that I need something more than what I've got. And I'm asking you, meaning me, to do that with me. What could be more faithful than that?
Right. The Bible in Hebrews, I think it's Hebrews 12:1. I've never been good with addresses in the Bible, but faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. And so recovery is something that is hoped for. Recovery is kind of this, really an abstract idea when you really think about it. And it is something that I hope for. It is something that I can't see right now, but I have faith in believing that it will get better. And one of the groups I do a spiritual life group for our men's center here on Monday night and Thursday night up at our women's center. And the women's center group we have kind of informally called the Promises Group, because somehow we keep always circling back around to the promises in the big book. And that takes an immense amount of faith to believe that those promises are going to come true if, as you said, Kira, I trust the process. If I keep doing this, I see these promises, will they come true? And they see evidence, the evidence of things not seen. They see evidence. This is why the 12-step program is just so beautiful, is because every time you go to a meeting, you see evidence of something that you can't see in your own life. And so that requires faith to know, to believe that that can happen for me if I keep doing the work. So if I keep doing the concrete steps, the concrete work, then faith tells me that these things will come true in my life. The promises will come true. And I love seeing that. I just love seeing the promises come true for clients, and watching them kind of come into that almost by accident. It seems like, all of a sudden, hey, wait a minute, I'm into my step 10 or 11 or whatever, and all of a sudden I'm realizing the promises for step 9 are coming true. And it's just such a wonderful thing to watch.
The hope comes in seeing it in another, is what.
Exactly. Yes. Hope is passed from person to person.
Right.
And so, we give each other hope, or we gain hope from other people. It's not something that just kind of drops out of the air onto us. And so it's passed from one person.
Down all the Jimisms.
There's a lot of them.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to go back and watch this recording like 10 times.
Yeah. With I had a client in treatment here about 8 months ago. And he said, I have so much trouble with step 2. He said, I just wish God would just show up and talk to me. And so, so I just kind of let that go. Sometimes we just have to let them be for a while. And in one of the groups, we have volunteers zooming into one of the groups. A volunteer said something to him about how he struggled with step 2, and about how he had to just put everything that he believed aside and start over with step 2. And somehow that connected up.
For just a second, so that folks watching can know that step 2 is to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity.
Yes.
There's a lot we can dive into there.
Oh my goodness.
Any one of these can take I mean, what feels like forever. I mean, when you were talking earlier about the 12, and you said 2 and then 3, and I'm like, wait. The leap, even if we got 2, the leap from 2 to 3, I was just there's so much
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
unpack.
Step 2, by the way, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. If you have clients who are really struggling with that, there's an excellent book put out by AA World Service called Came to Believe.
Right.
And it's stories about people who struggle with step 2. And it is just, as a matter of fact, I was going to show it to you, but I lent it to a client who is struggling with step 2 right now. And I said, go read this and come back and let's talk. And he hadn't brought it back to me yet. But so anyway, this client heard what that volunteer said. And actually the volunteer was an alumni of MARR, and something just clicked for him. And from that point forward, he began to see how he could begin to understand God. Step 3 says, turn our will and our life over to the care of God as we understood him. It doesn't mean how somebody else understands God. It means how we understand God. And something just clicked for him, and he moved forward, and it became very eye-opening for him. So anyway, my point to this story is that it was much later in his treatment that he mentioned that again. I just wish God would show up. And I said, God didn't have to. He sent this other guy to you.
Right.
And he kind of stepped back and he said, yeah, I guess you're right. I guess you're right. So yeah, God works through us. That hope you mentioned, Beth, for other people. And God works through us. And so that's the place I like to see people get to, is that rather than looking for some external measurement of God, how do I see God working through other people? How do I see God working in my life in these ways that I can't explain? And so, in the 12 and 12, it talks that 12 steps and 12 traditions. I'm sorry, I'm using all this lingo, expecting everybody to, know what I'm saying. Another AA book, it talks about step 2, about some of the roadblocks for step 2. And within that context, some tips for moving forward. We have to separate physical measurements from belief. We have to replace proof with trust. And so, we want this proof, we want this physical measurement. But honestly, if I have reached this place in my life because of my addiction, what proof would ever be enough? What physical proof would ever be enough for me? There just simply isn't enough proof. And so it becomes a place of surrender. It becomes a place of not trying to control everything, and just allowing, something to kind of grow naturally that isn't there with addiction. And so anyway,
Well, can we pause there for just a
yeah.
second and dig a little bit on
Uh-huh.
that, because I don't know that is just unique to substance use disorder. And back to step 2, the restoration to sanity, seems like that can be applied to other mental health conditions, right? And
Yes.
I don't see that done a lot. I see them pretty segregated. We really believe in that integration, that principle we've embraced this year of recovery is for everyone. And so what are your thoughts about that, Jim, about a substance use disorder versus, say, an eating disorder or a mental health issue?
Yeah, I think that there is a difference in approaches because of the effect on the brain of these different disorders.
Yep.
We have to assess where the person's at. Can I approach the person from a more abstract perspective of, say, doctrine and belief, or does it have to be more concrete in terms of daily practices that promote connection? And so, for example, someone with a mental health disorder, someone with schizophrenia, you can't really talk about spirituality from a place of large abstract doctrine or beliefs. That simply does not work.
Right.
What you have to approach is a very concrete day-to-day practices that promote connection. And early in recovery, we'll see that that's the way people need to think, because remember, I mean, addiction, substance use is a brain disease, and it has affected the brain on a very fundamental level. The limbic system and the prefrontal cortex and the pathway, the dopamine pathway and the glutamate pathway back down, it has radically altered that. And so when a person first gets into recovery, their prefrontal cortex is not functioning appropriately. And so we have to look at what are the day-to-day practices that promote connection. Later, we can begin to talk about the bigger ideas, doctrines and, bigger, more abstract things, because the prefrontal cortex is starting to work again. The blood flow is returning to normal and it's starting to work. But, this is why the AA program says no new relationships for a year, because they know that you're working out of your limbic system, your survival mode, more than you are your prefrontal cortex for probably 6 months to a year. And relationships are more abstract. And so we want to be careful with, you have to kind of assess where that person's at. And so eating disorders, interestingly enough, once again, there is a radical disconnect with the self with an eating disorder, where emotions are immediately manifested through physical acting out. It's a little bit different than a substance use disorder like alcoholism, for example, where I would ingest alcohol to alter my feelings. Feelings for a person with an eating disorder kind of automatically get, there's a word I'm looking for that I can't come up with, but automatically get acted out physically. Right. And so, I used to be the lead counselor for eating disorders when I was at SAFE. And so I watch this happen all the time. And so it is that disconnect from self, and body image is a perfect example. When I look at myself, I see myself as obesely overweight, when really my BMI is way too low. And so that's a radical disconnect with the self. And so even when we talk about how it affects the brain, we're talking about something deeply spiritual with that. So person with an eating disorder, really the task I see with them is to begin the connection of self, to begin to understand this is the feeling I'm having. I'm having anxiety, for example. I'm working with somebody right now, as a matter of fact, with an eating disorder here at our men's center. And where I'm trying to help him get to is, I have anxiety. Well, how can I express that anxiety in a way that is different than restricting? Because that's the physical manifestation of my feelings, is that restricting or the purging or whatever. And so rather than the physical manifestation, then I want to be able to connect up with, this is what my feeling is. How do I tolerate it? And, how do I tolerate that feeling without acting out? And every time I'm able to tolerate it without acting out, then I'm building my recovery from that, and I'm deepening the connection with myself. DBT, really dives into this with personality disorders, dialectical behavior therapy, in terms of mindfulness, in terms of tolerating our emotions and regulating emotions. It's a lot of the same kind of work with eating disorders. And so I think that, that's the first step for someone with an eating disorder, is that connection with self. Once we have been able to establish that connection with self, then we can begin to move further out with that. For substance use disorders, it tends to work more quickly, because they're not necessarily manifesting their acting out through their own physical body. They are ingesting a substance, for
It's an
example, to
alter rather than an expression. I mean, I think
yes,
that it
yeah,
is an energy flow. So if I'm acting out of an eating disorder, I am expressing.
mhm,
If I am drinking to alter, I'm suppressing,
yeah,
really.
yeah. And they will, I mean, they have similar effects on the dopamine levels in the brain.
Right.
I mean, so, eating disorders, behavioral addictions such as gambling and religious addiction have very similar dopamine effects as alcohol and drugs do. And so that part is the same, but there is a deeper disconnect with someone with an eating disorder than there is, I have found, with their own body than there is someone with substance use disorder. So you have to kind of assess, what their disorder is, what is the effect on the brain, and would the more concrete interventions work better for them than just diving into something, let's take a look at some abstract belief systems and doctrines.
What are some of those concrete? Can you give us some examples of those things like you did with the act of eating, right? This very basic connecting to physical sensations in the body once they start to return,
Right.
honoring those rather than ignoring them completely and doing the opposite thing of
Right.
what,
Right. Well, let's take anger, for example. So many persons with eating disorders have extreme difficulty expressing anger in an appropriate manner. And so if they find themselves in a situation where anger begins to come, and maybe justifiably so, they begin to feel anger, a lot of times they will suppress that anger, but it comes out some other way. Comes out perhaps through some type of purging, comes out through some type of restricting or binging or whatever, but it will come out. The problem is the they're not direct with their anger. It becomes, or their anxiety. I said before, when I was doing when I was lead counselor for eating disorders, and we were having group. This is going to sound a little gross, and I apologize for that. I would never let anyone leave the room. And so if we were talking about particularly, anxiety producing things, I had a special trash can. If they needed to throw up, they would throw up in that trash can. Then we would begin to talk about, now, what are you feeling? What are the emotions there? And let's talk about those. Let's begin to express those emotions in an appropriate way. And so a person I'm working with right now who has extreme difficulty with anger, he talked about anger at a peer. And I said, well, what happened to that anger? He said, oh, I just, I can't remember the word he used, but he just meant I just shove it down. Then he ends up restricting. And I said, well, I want to invite you to express your anger. You can do it, express it with me. But let's look at how that expresses, because like you said, Beth, it's energy. And that energy needs to be expressed, and we can express it in a healthy way or an unhealthy way. So directly to your question, Kira, I think that allowing the feelings to be, it so automatically gets suppressed that awareness of the feelings is the first thing.
Yeah. Not
Then,
overriding.
yes. Then I need to voice those feelings and give a voice to them, because so many people with an eating disorder have been through abuse of some sort. And typically it has not been a single incident. Typically it's been ongoing abuse, and they don't have a voice. The person I'm working with right now was just emotionally abused and didn't have a voice. And so I'm trying to help him have a voice rather than restrict and hold back, have a voice to get these emotions out. I think those are the two most healing things: awareness of the feelings and voicing those feelings early on are the two most healing things, accompanied with a good meal plan the very behavioral kinds of interventions that they need in order to build a healthy body and build a healthy diet and healthy practices. So, it's a matter of expression, really, in some ways, and getting them to express these feelings. And that goes over into substance use disorders as well. I think the appropriate expression of feelings is just so critical, so important.
Yeah.
I mean, we function here at MARR on a therapeutic community model. And I know this sounds a little sadistic, but it's just wonderful when two guys are in some kind of conflict, not physical conflict, but are in some kind of conflict and they're getting mad at each other. It's like, finally, you're able to express it. Now how do you do that appropriately? How do you express that anger appropriately? So many of our clients, and I think, Beth, you're right. This isn't just in the addiction treatment field. This is in the world in general. How many people need to have a voice?
Yes.
How many, and we see this in our society with the Black Lives Matter movement. The voice has been suppressed. We want to have a voice. And, it's just so critical. And so to be able to provide that for our clients is absolutely critical without trying to restrict how their voice is or who they are.
Well, and more than that, finding voice in the context of community, right? That I'm doing that in connection with others.
Yeah.
That's the
Watching other people do it and seeing what an example looks like. Many years ago, a colleague, a mentor, taught me, when he was working with kids. I find it so useful with adults, actually, and even with myself. And he said, name it, claim it, and tame it. Not tame it like it should be tamed, but appropriately, as you're talking about, Jim. But I think the disconnection for people has been so deep and for so long that to even name an emotion, to identify what it is hard. And so we have these other examples of Beth, like in community, watching other people who might have paved the way and gone a little bit before us, or even, I've got this piece of paper, I've got different ones, wheels and whatever, but here's words, here are feeling words. Like, just look at the list. Does anything let's just name it first, right? And then we can claim it. This is what I'm feeling.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
This is
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what you're talking about, I think, is a very concrete example of connection to self.
Yes.
Being able to identify what I'm experiencing right now.
And it's okay.
And it's okay.
Right. That's the other thing. And here's the follow-up piece of this, which is why community is so desperately important, is that the acceptance that we find within the 12-step program, the acceptance that we find like in treatment, when our true self comes out, whether it's anger or anxiety or shame, here it is, to be accepted by other people for even with these things is one of the most deeply spiritual things that can ever happen for a person, to be accepted for who they are. This gives us what I believe is a true picture of God: unconditional acceptance, unconditional positive regard, unconditional. And the program strives for this almost more so than anything else I ever see in our society. The 12-step program moves towards this and this unconditional acceptance, because most of our clients have grown up with ideas that their acceptance is dependent upon certain conditions. And we're humans, so yeah, that's going to happen. But when we can find that acceptance, so Kira, like you were talking about, here are my feelings, here are my emotions, and I'm dumping them out. This deep shame that I feel, here it is, I dump it out, and people look at me and say, yeah, I know, welcome. It's just, I don't see how anybody can resist that personally. I'll never forget the first time I walked into a 12-step meeting and felt accepted for the first time in my life. They had no idea who I was. They didn't know why I was there. And I felt acceptance simply because I had walked through the door. And that was irresistible to me. Irresistible. Having grown up in an addicted home where I was not accepted, and my mother never, who was the addict in the family, never made any apologies for not wanting children. Not feeling that, and then to feel that was completely irresistible to me. And so, it is that then that leads us to how we conceptualize God. Let me just say, on steps 2 and 3, one of the things I will take our clients through is a exercise where I say, now, what are the characteristics and ideas about God that you grew up with? And we'll list those up on the board. And some of them are helpful. Some of them are very harmful. That God's going to send you to hell if you step out of line, that God's very judgmental, in other words, there are these conditions. Then we talk about step 2 quite a bit, and hindrances to step 2, and some about step 3. But then at the end of that, I say, now, what if you could design God, which sounds heretical, I know. If you could design God, what would God be like? Mm-hmm. And they immediately begin throwing out all loving, unconditional, accepting, these things that, they all, and so I list those up on the board. And there's always somebody who says, we can't do this. I said, well, let me, this is sinful, or this is wrong, or, who are we to design God? I said, well, let me just say something about that. Everything, and this is always the case 100% of the time. I said, everything that we have listed up there, I can back up with a Bible verse. Everything we have listed up there, I can back up through the Quran. Everything that we have listed up there, I can back up through every major religion in the world. And so what I want you to see is that we are not designing God, we're finding God. So I try to get them to move from those harmful ideas about God into the healthy ideas, which, like I said, I can back up every single one that everybody ever says with a Bible verse.
This is the trauma I was talking about earlier. It's not just things that have happened to us. I'm talking about this idea of God, how we came to our understanding, and how our relationship to something greater than ourselves is built, I think, can be a trauma that needs to be healed.
Absolutely. This is what is termed spiritual abuse.
Yeah.
When beliefs are so rigid and we are seen as defective and unloved based on conditions. Mm-hmm. This is spiritual abuse. And so many people are products of this type of abuse. And it is very traumatic because it absolutely distorts and skews, a vision of God as loving and healing. And so based on what, someone in their own conception has come up with. And so, yes, you're absolutely right, Kira, that this is very traumatic, and it's a very subtle trauma. Mm-hmm. It's not, it's not getting beat up. It's more insidious, I guess, because it eats away at us at a much slower pace, and it gets into something very deep within us, that connection, and it eats away at acceptance. It eats away at our personhood. It eats away at these things very slowly and insidiously. And that's extremely abusive. And we don't often recognize it as that, but it really is. It's abuse just the same as emotional or sexual abuse, where it destroys our personhood. And it is such a huge barrier for so many people, whether it's in the addiction treatment field or not. You're right. And unfortunately, we see this kind of polarization of defending these kinds of abuses in our society, and versus those who are much more open and flexible. So, Yeah, anytime you come up with a very rigid belief system that is the main focus is on the person, and their wrongdoing rather than starting the belief system on God, uh, then you're going to end up with problems. You're going to end up with problems because theology, like philosophy, will start with a main premise. And if you start your main premise at human beings, your theology gets way out of whack really fast.
Right.
If you start your main premise with God, then your theology will develop in a much stronger fashion, in a much more open and flexible fashion. And at its heart, every major religion will start with their conception of God. The expressions of religion in whatever religious form that start with the conception of human beings, we find problems with. We find radicalism, we find rigidity, we find hatred. And that's because they started their conception at human beings. And that will always end up in the wrong place rather than at God. So there's that soapbox.
That's when you listen with your heart. And I mean, time has kind of been suspended for,
I know.
and Jim, I just want to affirm you and what you do.
Gosh.
This is your calling, clearly, and this, we could stay on with you. I feel confident in speaking for Kira on this all day, listening and talking about this. And so, but our time is short, so I'd like to end with 2 pointed questions, if I may.
Yep.
And they're kind of related and probably reflect my own views. They do. But the first is there anything more important in the healing process than what we're talking about?
Of course, you can accuse me of a great deal of bias with this one, but I don't think so.
I don't either.
Hope and meaning and connection are the essence of healing. Whether my body heals or not, are the essence of healing for everyone.
So if that is the case, why is this? We're having a professional dialogue. This is 3 professionals coming together to talk about something that's critical to healing and which we all believe is the most critical. Why are we not, as a field, talking about this?
Yeah, I know, Jerome Frank and Irvin Yalom said the installation of hope is like really high up there in critical factors for therapy. And yet here's my opinion, is because we have drifted into the medical model.
Okay.
And now it is a physical disease, the brain and all that. I get that. However, because it is the brain, we have to appreciate the spiritual aspect of this. It's not like I have cancer in my body and some, medication is going to take care of that. We have drifted into the medical model that suspends or sets aside all subjective data. Yeah. And that has been so damaging to our field, to the field of therapy in general. Here's my evidence-based, and there's nothing wrong with evidence-based practices. They work really good. But if I only focus on here's my evidence-based practice, then that will set aside the more subjective items of hope, of meaning, in finding these things within life, which is really what we're striving for. And they create physical disease. And so the physical disease that we have in some ways is because we have lost our way with these other things. And so, yes, I have to address the physical disease, but to stop there is inadequate and incomplete. So yes, the brain needs to heal from addiction, but that is incomplete unless I follow that up with how do I find hope and meaning and recovery, further along.
Right.
So,
Beth, I feel very hopeful, actually, oddly enough, because I sometimes don't around certain things. But with this, I really do feel hopeful because of the increase in the popularity of some, people are all about right now mindfulness.
Yes.
It's such a buzzword.
Yeah.
I think that it's a real opportunity because, like Jim, like you talked about, this is a way in when people are resistant to the word spirituality or God, that when we're talking about connection to ourselves, to somebody else, to something greater than me, it's mindfulness, it's connection, right? And that's, I feel hopeful, Beth. I think that, and even with Western medicine, I think we're seeing shifts with physicians more and more, that when I hear a cardiologist say something like, this isn't about a statin, or this is about stop talking about managing your stress differently and manage your stress differently. and when a doctor says maybe some meditation, I'm like, okay, it's inspiring. And I feel hopeful, Jim, that a movement, a shift is happening. Like you talk about, things are changing always. I think it's changing. It may not be miles and miles every day, but I think it is. I think it is.
Maybe so.
I hope.
Yeah, may it be so. I'm with you. I can't thank you enough, Jim. This was so good. So
Mhm.
good.
For me too.
Any closing thoughts?
It is, I think, the way forward. It is how the program, the 12-step program, has always appreciated recovery.
Yeah.
Has always appreciated the fact that there are very real physical components to it, but a very real physical allergy, as the 12-step program talks about, but that this is really the critical aspect. Spirituality is really the critical aspect. Without it, we really can't, we really don't have recovery. We have abstinence, but we really don't have recovery.
Yes, right on. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you,
Look
Jim.
forward to talking.
Thanks, guys.
Take care.
All right.